Thank you, Sasha, and it's really good to see everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Anne Lounsbury from the Department of Russian Slavic Studies at NYU and also of the Jordan Center, and it's really wonderful to see so many people joining us here today to talk about Catherine II's instruction, her Nakaz, to the Legislative Commission of 1767. Thank you very much to Bella Grigoryan, who organized this event. Bella Grigoryan, Kirill Ospovat, and Andrei Kostin will each be speaking. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them very, very briefly. Our 19V habit is abbreviated introductions, so I'll stick with that. And I'm going to tell you everybody's paper topic, and then I'm going to hand it over to the speakers. So Bella Grigoryan's topic, Bella is joining us from Pittsburgh, and her paper topic is on reading Catherine II's Nakaz, Material and Conceptual Histories. Then we'll hear from Kirill Ospovat, who's joining us right now from Berlin, and his paper is entitled Catherine, Montesquieu, and Pugachev, the Nakaz, Serfdom, and Peasant Cossack Insurrection. And finally, we'll hear from Andrei Kostin, whose title is Nakaz and Lubki, the Art of Negotiating Norms Through Ambiguity. And once again, I feel really fortunate to have three specialists joining us together and so many of you here online. Okay, thank you very much. Bella.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Anne, and genuine thanks to you, Anne, to you, Sasha, and to the Jordan Center for hosting us. We are located far away from one another, the three of us, and it is so wonderful to be able to do this remotely and to come together remotely at the Jordan in this way. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna try to share screen. Okay. Good. Can you see everything? All right.
Yep.
Okay. So, and thanks so much to everyone in the audience for turning up on what is in Pittsburgh an unusual thing, a sunny early afternoon. So thanks so much for coming. So Catherine II's наказ комиссии о сочинении проекта нового уложения, which is known in English as her instruction, sometimes grand instruction, to the Legislative Commission of 1767, is a relatively well-studied text. My paper comes from a new project in which I'm contemplating what might be gained by writing about the Nakaz in relation to the history of books and of reading, using methods drawn perhaps from media history and situating the Nakaz in its variegated media environments. In such a larger project, I would be interested in tracing a relatively long paper trail of responses to or impressions from the Nakaz, produced both during the years immediately after its promulgation and, of course, also much later. Today, the scope of my paper is going to be limited just to episodes in the reception of the Nakaz in the handful of years following its composition. But first, what was the Nakaz? Isabel de Madariaga, one of Catherine's most perceptive readers, explains that the Nakaz is not a series of laws, and it is not a constitution in the modern sense of the word constitution. This distinction between being a series of laws or not being a series of laws is actually quite important, and at the end of my talk, I'll discuss how one contemporary was aware of the possibility that the Nakaz could be read as law, even before the Empress had promulgated the document. So not intended as law, the Nakaz was rather, and here I'm borrowing Madariaga's language, a series of propositions culled from what seemed to Catherine the best and most modern political theorists of her time, integrated into a fairly coherent whole and setting out the basic principles of a well-ordered government and society. So, her borrowings, her debts, her taking of ideas and text from Montesquieu, Grigoryan, and others, of course, are too well known to reiterate here. As you know, the immediate purpose of the Nakaz was to direct the work of the Legislative Commission of 1767, a body comprised of elected delegates assembled from throughout the Russian Empire, and including representatives of multiple socialist states. Parenthetically, I'm aware, of course, that it's been proposed in multiple helpful accounts that Catherine summoned the commission in a way in an attempt to secure her illegitimate and uncertain position on the throne. But that's not what interests me here. The commission was meant to, but did not produce a legal code, as you know. Its meetings were halted, as you know, at least partly by the beginning of the Russo-Ottoman War. The commission continued to exist nominally during her reign, but it did no more substantial work. All the same, the Nakaz continued to circulate, which brings me to a brief foray into a kind of just the beginnings of a material history. I've called my paper on reading Catherine's Nakaz because in the story I want to share, I'm most interested in encounters with the Nakaz as text on paper. And so my focus is going to be on what I would almost term hyperliterate responses to the Nakaz, responses that are, one could even say, sort of overdetermined by their print media environment. But in fact, as we know, text on paper was sort of not the only way in which contemporaries encountered this text. It seems reasonable to suggest that a substantial number could have heard Nakaz read aloud, making for a potential auditory reception history. I'm not going to focus at length at this time on this dimension of its reception, but I want to attend to it a little because I don't want my narrative to obscure this aspect of the Nakaz's dissemination. The Nakaz was to be read monthly at meetings of the Legislative Commission, and it has been estimated that about 3/4 of the commission's activity, that is, the active time spent in meetings, was probably taken up with procedural matters and the reading and the rereading of the Nakaz. And we know also that one possible result of this is that it was common for deputies to quote from it, and there are various explanations for that, and we could talk about that perhaps later. As you also know, according to a Senate ukaz of 1768, April, the Nakaz was to be sent to 54 government offices in the Russian Empire and to the chancelleries of each gubernia, where it was to be read aloud once a month, but not to everyone. No one among the, and I'm borrowing my language from Nadezhda Platinskaya, who's joining here. So no one from among the Nizhnie канцелярские служители, or people who were not affiliated with a relevant office, could be given the Nakaz to read or to copy. So it was not meant to be disseminated to everyone. Special care was taken to discourage the circulation of the Nakaz in manuscript, which is a reminder that manuscript culture was an active sphere of media distinct from, but not without overlap with, the print graphosphere occasioned by movable type. And I want to think about multiple modes as well as media of dissemination, like manuscript print, not in competition with one another, not about to overtake one another. That's not the kind of story I'm telling here, but rather coeval in the period's graphosphere, a term I borrow from Simon Franklin. It would be difficult to define the readership of the Nakaz in the 18th century and the effects of its circulation in a kind of a complete way. And I'm not at all dealing with the Nakaz outside of Russia, although probably many of the people in the audience are well aware of its circulation or non-circulation, say in France, for instance. But in Russia, it was published several times during Catherine's reign. There are 4 Russophone editions. This is not as nice of a reproduction as I had hoped, I'm sorry, but there was an 1783 edition as part of Sbornik Ukazov. There was 2 bilingual editions, Russian, German, and Russian, Greek, 1 quadrilingual edition, which I have here, Russian, Latin, German, French, and 1 French-only domestic Russia-made edition. William E. Butler calls the quadrilingual edition, which I've tried to reproduce here, but perhaps not very successfully, of 1770, the most desirable and rarest of all, and finds the Russo-Greek text of 1771 noteworthy for its beauty. And some of these are, of course, bibliophile items. So the unilingual Russian edition was on sale at the Academy bookshop for 50 kopecks. And Oleg Melchenko puts the total print run of the Nakaz produced during Catherine's reign at about 5,000 copies, which is a high number, given how small readerships were at the time. So let me conclude this piece with the report that is quoted by a number of historians that in 1818, 1,421 copies of the Nakaz were being sold off at 4 rubles and 5 kopecks a pud, and a pud is 30-some pounds, and they were to be pulped. So this moment is noted by multiple historians, and one could interpret it in a number of different ways, of which I want to contemplate very briefly just a couple. So there were so many, 1,421, I guess, unwanted, unpurchased, unclaimed copies of the Nakaz. Perhaps because Catherine was like a number of 18th century cultural producers who were writing for a tiny readership. In other words, a print run of 5,000 overall was just far too large. One could think about also, of course, means of dissemination, infrastructural networks for the transmission of the Nakaz and their relative adequacy. And one could also think about curbing circulation in various ways, as I've kind of discussed. Now, the Nakaz reached some readers even before it was disseminated officially. Catherine invited a number of people to review it in draft form. These readers include her secretary and collaborator, Grigoryan, and others. To gauge its potential reception among the educated and political elites, Catherine shared a draft with Mikhail Vorontsov. She shared a draft with General-Poruchik Alexander Bibikov, who would become Marshal of the Legislative Commission, also with one of the Chancellor's secretaries, Vasily Baskakov, to whom I'll return. And of course, most famously, she shared it with the poet and dramatist Alexander Sumarokov. Others, like high-ranking clergy, were also invited to read it. And probably Grigory Orlov would have been familiar with it. Today, I'm going to linger over Sumarokov's documentary and potential literary responses to the Nakaz. I'm going to speak a little about Mikhail Shurbatov's infamous, now not unknown then, of course, response to it. And I'm going to consider briefly some of Catherine's own post-Nakaz writing to think about the status of the law, zakon, in these texts. My argument issues from the observation that however we understand the scope of the Nakaz's dissemination, it probably did reshape the Russian imperial political imaginary with respect to such concepts as law. Sumarokov's, Shurbatov's, and Catherine's post-Nakaz texts evince an awareness of the legal as a category of socio-political experience. I'm by no means claiming that this awareness is totally new or generated out of thin air by the Nakaz. Of course, in Russian political history, the notion that a legal document might limit absolute autocracy dates back at least as far as 1730. But in the years following the promulgation of the Nakaz, Sumarokov's, Shurbatov's, and Catherine's writings engage with the law as concept, as aspiration, and perhaps most of all as a kind of conspicuous absence. They do this in different ways. Considering these texts together helps us glimpse a kind of emergence of a socio-political imaginary around, again, the concept of law and also to some extent limited monarchy. In the 1760s version of Catherinian Enlightenment, воспитание and reading as a form of воспитание loomed large. Fittingly, the Nakaz had emphasized the importance of reading and rereading. So I don't want to read the entire quote because actually I don't necessarily need it, but I'll leave it for you to have a look. Particularly, но всякий поймет сей наказ, если со прилежанием и при встречающихся случаях выберет из оного то, что ему в рассуждениях его правилам служить может. This emphasis on rereading is not surprising, particularly since in book history terms, so-called intensive reading, reading the same text many times, as one might a devotional text, may have been a normal part of the period's reading habits. The Commission's rereadings engage in a kind of potential, I guess, intensive reading en masse. They also implicitly participate in a kind of utopian project. Everyone may be able to understand the Nakaz by making an effort. One of the remarkable things about Sumarokov's response to the draft of Nakaz is that the papers contain Catherine's reactions. Where Sumarokov claims that upon reading the entire Nakaz, one might forget much of it, Catherine can scarcely hide her irritation as she writes, «Для того предписано дважды читать», where I think rereading seems to be offered as a kind of panacea to all that Sumarokov finds wrong. Sumarokov is among the most careful of the contemporary readers of the Nakaz. He catches a good deal that's inconsistent. He critiques her categorization of kinds of law. He objects to her proposals, of course, for the slow, gradual emancipation of serfs. Memorably, he writes, «Ныне помещики живут покойно в отчинах», to which the still imperfectly Russophone empress responds inimitably with «И бывают зарезаны отчасти от своих». Most fundamentally, Sumarokov objects to the divergence between what he perceives as contemporary Russian reality and Catherine's investment in European humanistic and liberal thought. He glimpses the Nakaz's central contradiction, her simultaneous embrace of European liberalism and absolute unchecked autocracy. Sumarokov's later appraisals of Catherine's political and legislative activity may be found in Dmitry Samazvanets, with which I'm not dealing today, and also in the 1774 publication of Izot Торжественной, to which I now turn. Sumarokov reworked the contents of Izot Торжественной, introducing numerous cuts and omissions when it comes to the odes concerned with Catherine, A striking omission, of course, is Catherine as legislator. A good example would be this stanza being cut. Законы твердыни ныне стали, and so forth. Another good example would be this cut. В том на грудь бия руками, в горести вседневном дня, с распущенными волосами, очи к трону глазя. I don't have time to offer a close reading here, but I can't quite resist noting that the configuration of actants here, a feminized, loose-haired empire begging the throne for laws, reiterates actually one of the problems that both Sumarokov and Shcherbatov glimpse in the Nakaz. The laws issue from the monarch, and therefore, in a sense, rule of law happens at the whim of the monarch, of course. So even the purportedly laudatory extracted stanza could have been seen as critical. Sumarokov reworked a number of his ceremonial odes, first for the 1769 Разные стихотворения, then for the 1774 Ode Торжественные, which has been reprinted in the 21st century with really useful commentary. In this wonderful reprint edition, Ronald Roon situates Sumarokov's revisions against two axes. First, the notion that Sumarokov deleted portions of his odes in which he had been too laudatory towards a monarch, and particularly in the odes about Catherine, that they were rewritten in part due to the poet's dissatisfaction with their politics. And the second axis, more stylistic than ideological in a way, whose chief proponent is Yutinyanov, of course, that Sumarokov was smoothing away the bombastic Lomonosovian aspects of his own verse. And here we should recall that in Tinyanov's analysis, or what kind of emerges from his analysis of hearing versus reading an ode, this is a key distinction, hearing versus reading. And so crucially, Sumarokov's critique of Lomonosovian style, of course, is the critique of someone immersed in the paper realm in reading. Roon accepts that some omissions are political in nature, but to explain the entire Ode Торжественные project as a whole, he offers a third way. He reads Sumarokov's revisions in the context of what is an attempt to compose a cohesive poetry cycle about Russian political history. When it comes to the Catherinian odes, how apparent would the cuts have been to a reader? Well, it depends on the reader, of course. Catherine is, as we know, is among the epoc's more careful, not to say pedantic readers. So Vera Praskurina, writing about the 1774 the Торжественные version of the 1762 ode, explains that for the initiated, the truncated text of the new redaction of 1774 sounded like serious, I quote, political protest. And indeed, this was apparent to Catherine, who was so irked by the changes that she ordered in January 75, that all of Sumarokov's future writings be subject to review by the censors of the Academy of Sciences. And as we know previously, she was his censor, which allowed him to republish things that had been previously published without much oversight. If we take Ode Торжественные as Sumarokov's reading in the sense of the Nakaz, and especially of all the ways in which the Nakaz and the Legislative Commission fell short, then we have a kind of hyperliterate statement, one whose very legibility depends upon the audience's intimate knowledge of the poems. And here I want to move briefly to another highly literate response, that of Mikhail Shcherbatov, who produced a rather long, detailed, in a sense, critique of the Nakaz, which he did not intend, I think it's fair to say, for public circulation. Shcherbatov offers both a critique and a series of glosses upon the text. At times, his notes are limited to identifying the specific, source passages from Montesquieu, which is the chief intertext here, of course. So he writes with the spirit of the law, or the reason of the laws as it was understood in the 18th century, in hand, so to speak. So his reaction to the Nakaz is mediated by reading Montesquieu in a number of places where he shows that the Empress omits crucial passages from her source text, thereby distorting Montesquieu and attempting to smooth away, again, the central contradiction of the Nakaz, rule of law versus an absolute monarch who is the source of laws and therefore is not subject to the laws. So he cites Montesquieu chapter and verse and shows exactly what lines have been omitted. And here you can see some of his sort of commentary. So Shcherbatov's reception of Catherine's text is filtered at almost every turn by her source text, which is also to say that he's reading in a kind of saturated environment. And it's this print media environment of a careful reader, pen in hand, so to speak, that occasions for him to the space to think about the relative merits of republicanism versus monarchy. Shirbatov writes what one might call a kind of counter-Nakaz, in which he endorses a republican model of government and the rule of law, which he intimates has not come to pass, writing probably around 1772-73. It's pretty clear he's writing during the times of Pugachev. So now very briefly, I want to turn to Catherine's writings, and particularly to Всякая всячина, and its treatment of Zakon. So whereas Sumarokov would торжественно narrate Russian history in a series of poems that in their revised form are less odic than the earlier versions, Всякая всячина offers what was for Russia a relatively new cultural import, the moral satirical weekly modeled on the English and also German predecessors that Catherine probably knew. In his book on Nikolai Novikov, W. Garrett Jones pointed out that with the disbanding of the Legislative Commission due to the Russo-Ottoman War might not mean the end of all its activity. Jones sees the appearance of Russian satirical journalism that had its inception in Catherine Kazitsky's Всякая всячина of 1969 as a continuation of the Legislative Commission's deliberations, transferred to a different generic space. The satirical weeklies act as a kind of surrogate for the halted Legislative Commission. And indeed, Всякая всячина had posed one of the most vital questions from the beginning. Issue 4 opened with the query, к чему служат законы, когда нравы испорчены? As the late Viktor Markovich Zhivov proposed, the publication answered the question by suggesting the primacy of individual virtue over the presumably impersonal application of law. So, in Zhivov's formulation, in Всякая всячина, individual virtues and shortcomings are presented as the main levers that move the social and political world of the empire, and this allows Catherine, as a kind of failed lawgiver, to take little responsibility for the actual state of affairs. So Всякая всячина recasts the Russian political situation of 1769 as a lively exchange of ideas in an emergent public sphere. The English and German weeklies that are its predecessors have been studied as constitutive of the bourgeois public sphere. Of course, at this time, Russia had neither a bourgeoisie nor a public sphere in the Habermasian sense. Catherine wanted early in her reign to cultivate the middling sort of people, but she could not create a bourgeoisie by fiat. In her encouragement of the satirical weeklies that began with Всякая всячина, the Empress cultivated the cultural forms we associate with political representation and with representative democracies in the West, while, of course, preserving the absolutist status quo. The contradiction at the heart of this move again echoes the central problem of the Nakaz. Now let me begin to conclude now. One of the earliest readers of the Nakaz in draft form, Vasily Baskakov, to whom I finally return, and to whose comments Catherine responds very favorably with все его примечания умны, appears to have understood perfectly the daringness of the Nakaz, and therefore saw it as his duty to forewarn the Empress regarding the potential for undesirable interpretations, and I'm borrowing some of Irina Marasinova's very helpful formulations here. So Baskakov asks whether the Empress might like to include in the Nakaz's last paragraph that all the intended changes, намереваемые перемены, ought not be considered the law, не надлежит почитать законами, but rather only preparatory materials towards the law, so as to forestall civil unrest that might arise from misunderstandings. So Baskakov's comments also sort of gently point to one of the central tensions of the Nakaz, its apparent investment in guaranteeing to protect the freedom of citizens, and its insistence on absolute autocracy as the only source when such legal protections may issue. What all these different responses to the Nakaz have in common is their various collective registering of the conspicuous absence of law, and at the same time, in the registering of this absence, the articulation of a civic temperament that holds the potential to probe the limits of Russian absolutism. In one of the most often cited statements about the Nakaz, Vasily Ключевский wrote that the Nakaz could not create a new social order, but it disseminated in the higher echelons of society a new civic temperament, гражданское настроение. I would venture that even in the Nakaz's author, Catherine, and two of its most constructively critical readers, Sumarokov and Shirbatov, we glimpse this new civic temperament which hovers about concepts of law and the legal as a generative category of socio-political experience. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm next, right? Yes, so here we go with sorry.
And I'm sorry, I was speaking before when I was muted. I just said thank you to Bella for that fascinating paper. And now we will hear from Kirill. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anne. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So this talk comes from a book project I'm currently engaged in. It's a book-length study of the Pugachev Rebellion. And the basic premise that I'm arguing against in my study is that the Pugachev Rebellion, as a peasant Kazakh, also frontier insurrection, was somehow culturally and historically separate from what was going on in the capitals, in the intellectual environment where the Nakaz came from. So one of the tasks of my book is to reconnect the events of the Pugachev Rebellion, but also the languages of the Pugachev Rebellion. We have 400 pages worth of Pugachev manifestos to the social and political issues that were also at stake in Catherine's Nakaz and also in the Commission of 1767. Just to mention one detail, several deputies of the Commission actually fought on the side of Pugachev, while Bibikov, the marshal of the Commission, was one of the generals responsible for subduing the rebellion. So, in this short talk, one thing that I want to claim is that the Nakaz was already a text that was aware of the danger, not only of peasant slave insurrection, but also of the potential of a peasant revolution as a theoretically charged event, and that it obliquely addressed the issues that made such a revolution a necessary consequence of the Russian social order. So what I'm claiming is that Nakaz contains, based on Montesquieu, so it's not Catherine as a singular thinker, it's her as a very astute interpreter and compiler and reader of Western theory, that Nakaz already includes a theory of a peasant revolution on a level that needs to be uncovered. And so I'm going to, obviously, there is not going to be a lot of new material here. I'm going to start with the beginning, with Catherine's assessment of Petrine westernization of Russia. That is the starting point of the Nakaz, right? Russia is a European state. This is clearly demonstrated by the following observations. The alterations which Peter the Great undertook in Russia succeeded with a greater ease because the manners which prevailed at that time and had been introduced amongst us by a mixture of different nations, and the conquest of foreign territories were quite unsuitable to the climate. Peter I, by introducing the manners and customs of Europe among the European people in his dominions, found at that time such means as even he himself was not sanguine enough to expect. So one of the things that is happening here, so this is a basic model of the whole of Russian westernizing reformist monarchy, enlightened monarchy, that Catherine is continuing, right? Developing and continuing in her text. One of the things that is happening here is that she introduces the fundamental distinction that Montesquieu makes. Obviously, she's building on Montesquieu. Everything here is a quote from Montesquieu, almost. The distinction between laws and customs, right? And the way the distinction works is that Montesquieu claims that besides laws that are introduced by legislators from above, you also have actual customs of the nation as such that need to be taken account of. And this is a crucial achievement of Montesquieu as a political theorist, that he actually speaks about the ethnographic folkways, ways of life, as not something that has to be completely changed or abolished by some kind of enlightened reform, but something that has a political dignity of its own. You need to account for the customs of your own land. And this distinction between law and custom was crucial for Catherinian visions of noble literature, and a lot of literature of the nobility, like von Wiesen's comedies, built on that. But I'm going to be claiming today that why this matters is not just because of the nobility, but because this is a way in which Catherine admits that the peasant population, the peasant majority of Russia's population, is a problem, not only because it is in a social state that is not optimal, but also because the current condition denies the peasants their dignity. That the whole system that she herself inherits and keeps is building, that this whole system is built on a wrong footing, because the customs of the peasants and the peasants as bearers of those customs are subjected to a regime of violence. And this is actually what Montesquieu says in the fragment about Peter that Catherine paraphrased in the passage that I quoted above. So she takes this critique of Peter from Montesquieu, but Montesquieu says more than she does, right? So what he says is the law that obliged the Muscovites to shorten their beards and their clothing, and the violence of Peter I in trimming up to the knees the long robes of those who entered the towns, were both tyrannical. The means for preventing crimes are penalties. The means for changing manners are examples. The ease and promptness with which this nation has become orderly has shown that this prince had too low an opinion of it, and then these peoples were not beasts, as he said. The violent means he employed were useless. He would have accomplished his purpose as well by gentleness. So what Catherine finds in Montesquieu is a critique of her own, I mean Peter's, but also her own, the whole of Russian monarchy as Peter created it, as fundamentally despotic because it takes a fundamentally wrong approach to its own population. It takes its population for beasts while they're not. And Montesquieu is not inventing it. He took this analysis from John Perry's The State of Russia under the Present Tsar, which is an ethnographic account of Russia. John Perry worked under Peter, helped build, he was an English naval engineer who helped build the Russian Navy. He spent more than a decade in Russia. So his is a pretty reliable account. Right? And so he comments on how in the Russian system, the workers who do the whole work of building the Navy and the army and everything that Peter wants them to build are not encouraged by reward, but threatened by punishment. Peter himself sort of tries to do it differently, but this is how the system works. And then Perry writes, upon these considerations, it is no great wonder that the Russes are the most dull and heavy people to attain to any sort of science of any nation in the world, and upon every opportunity are the most apt to rebel and to engage in the most barbarous cruelties in hopes of being relieved from that slavery that is hereditary to them. Right? So in a standard reading of this discussion, this would be a debate about whether or not the Russians are inherently dull or inherently enslaved, right? But what Perry is saying is that he is addressing the way what the system does to its people, right? He doesn't say that the Russians are incapable of learning. He says that the system established by the Tsar and run by the Tsar functions in such a way that no free creative activity is possible because it's all about punishment and violence. So the Russians, and this is what the Montesquieu builds upon, the Russians are not dull, the Russians are not beasts, but the state system is so cruel to them that they rebel. And Perry witnessed actual rebellions during Peter's time. So again, this is an ethnographic commentary on the real Russian tradition of rebellions that obviously led up to the Pugachev rebellion that happened 6 years after the Nakaz. So Catherine, of course, starts engaging with this whole problematic in her commentary on Montesquieu and Strube de Permont's Lettres Russiennes, which was a refutation of Montesquieu's analysis of Russia. So Strube de Permont, a Petersburg French writing author, published his letters in 1760s, trying to refute Montesquieu's claim that Russians live in slavery and that Russia is a despotic country. And Catherine, who left her notes on this book before becoming empress, laughs at the absurdity of this argumentation. She defends firmly the analysis of Montesquieu, yes, that Russia is a despotic country, and moreover, that the problem here is not the lack of rights for the nobility, for example, but the lack of rights for serfs. Right? Montesquieu writes, a serf can do nothing by virtue, and the master in dealing with his slaves acquires all sorts of bad habits and gradually becomes accustomed to neglecting all moral virtues. So the system of enslavement keeps people from becoming themselves, developing their own virtue or enacting their own virtue, which is a category which can be related to the category of custom, right, to the category of manners. But this enslavement of the serfs poisons the whole system that stands above it, the nobility and the monarchy, right? So the enslavement of the serfs is a fundamental condition that turns Russia into a despotic monarchy. And this is something that Strube de Permont, writing on the orders of the Russian court of Empress Elizabeth, tries to refute, and something that Catherine definitely agrees with. Right. So this is where she comes. This is the position from which she comes to writing the Nakaz. She knows this, that this is the problem, the conditions of the serfs and its consequences for the whole Russian polity is the problem. She, of course, cannot write it directly, and this is why she never does publicly. But we can look at some of her non-public statements, such as those comments on Strube de Permont, which was just comments left in a book. And we can look at the way that she deals with Montesquieu in the Nakaz, right? So close to the chapter, to the excerpt about Peter that she paraphrases in the Nakaz, Montesquieu has another passage which Catherine ignores, even though she takes bits and pieces from that book of the Montesquieu, right? So what he says is that it is a maxim of capital importance that the mores and manners of a despotic state might never be changed. Nothing would be more promptly followed by a revolution. For in these states, there are no laws, so to speak. There are only mores and manners, and if you overturn them, and you overturn everything. So this is basically Montesquieu talking further about Peter the Great and the kind of general social laws and trends that his false reforms illustrate. So he says that Peter tried to reform manners in a despotic state, and that should never be done, because in a despotic state there are no laws. So basically, this is a theory of a revolution such as the Pugachev Rebellion that should happen as a backlash against the kind of tyrannical reforms that Peter carried out. And of course, we don't have to talk about Montesquieu being a prophet, because there always were massive rebellions within the Russian Empire. He didn't need to look forward to the Pugachev Rebellion. It was enough to read the news. But this is a theory of why such a revolution is not a matter of conservative masses reacting against progressive reforms, but a matter of how it is logical and natural for people, for masses, to resist such kind of despotic changes. And my claim is that this is how Catherine reads this is the Nakaz major issue, and this is how Catherine reads Montesquieu, because this is what she is thinking about. So within the Nakaz, we have another quote. This time it is direct quote from Montesquieu in paragraph 92. And I'm acknowledging the work of Nadezhda Plavinskaya, who is here, who gave us the beautiful edition of Nakaz listing all quotes from Montesquieu and other sources. So this is me building on Nadezhda Plavinskaya's work. But this is a direct quote from Montesquieu, right? Japanese histories inform us on the subject of education that we ought to treat children with indulgence, because correction hardens and makes them stubborn. At the same time, that slaves ought not to be used with too much severity, because they will immediately rebel in their own defense. By remarking the spirit which ought to animate and govern their domestic polity, could not they from thence have formed their idea of what ought to have been infused into the civil polity of the state? So she's saying that in the domestic context, and Montesquieu is saying, in the domestic context, slaves will rebel, and this should be the basic principle of civil governance in the state, that you have to deal with the severity towards enslaved populations as your primary issue. So we can see how in those, how Catherine obliquely deals with this problematic. Here is another text by Catherine that comments on the same issue. This is a letter to Prince Vяземский during the written during the commission of 1767. And the context for this letter was that the Senate, there were also peasant unrest at that time. And people were scared, the nobility was scared. So the Senate considered introducing additional penalty for peasant crimes against their owners, the same ones that Catherine mentioned in her response to Sumarokov, right? And Catherine was, so this is a private letter, right? It wasn't meant to be published. It's not a public document, but she was appalled by the thought that even more punishment would be applied to the peasants, and appalled not on moral grounds. What she writes is, пророчествовать можно, что если за жизнь одного помещика в ответ в наказание будут истребить целые деревни, то бунт всех крепостных деревень воспоследует, и что положение помещичьих крестьян таково критическое, что кроме как тишиной и человеколюбивыми учреждениями ничем избегнуть не можно. Итак, прошу быть весьма осторожным в подобных случаях, дабы не ускорить и без того довольно грозящую беду. Ибо если мы не согласимся на уменьшение жестокости и умерение человеческому роду нестерпимого наказания, то и против воли сами возьмут рано или поздно. So what we have here is not just an empirical assessment of the dangers of encirclement. What I would claim is that this letter is informed by the same kind of a theoretical thinking about the Russian society and the position of the serfs as its central problem that I was informed by Montesquieu. In other words, this letter is informed by what I would call a Montesquieu theory of the peasant revolution, which is a central moment in the Nakaz. There is a fantastic quote from Semyon Vorontsov, the Russian ambassador to London from the 1790s, and he comments on the experience of the French Revolution, and he says, what a great book Montesquieu wrote, that even such scoundrels as Pugachev, while they were not able to read Montesquieu, they acted upon its recommendations because they knew that in order to overthrow a monarchy, you need to destroy the nobility. So what Vorontsov did in the 1790s, Catherine already does in the 1760s. She recognizes how the peasant unrest that she is witnessing in Russia is not random, is not a matter of barbarity, is not русский бунт бессмысленный, беспощадный, but is a social action that needs to be theorized as a threat of a revolution. And so the last, my last bit is just a quote from one of the Pugachev manifestos. I'm not going to be able to go in depth into that, but I will just read this argument out loud and leave it as an open question. And my basic claim is, of course, that the people who are writing those manifestos are not speaking some other barbaric or exotic language of the masses, that they are speaking the same language, they're addressing the same issues that the Nakaz was already addressing, right? That there is no cultural division, there is no cultural abyss between the Pugachev manifestos and the Nakaz. So the Pugachev manifesto writes, преклонившиеся под нашу корону народы могут восчувствовать легкость от наложенного на них от злодеев чищайшего ига работы, освобождены будут от платежа подати, и дана им будет свободная вольность, без всякого в России притеснения, не так, как ныне Россия утеснена бедностью и отягощена работами, наложенными от злодеев, сребролюбцев и гордости наполненных дворян и находящихся в оградях губернаторов, воевод и прочих тому подобных мироедов, кои несытую своей завистью почти уже всю Россию поглотили, что нами все оное истреблено быть может. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirill. That was fascinating. And now we'll go to our final speaker, Andrei Kostin.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for organizing, and Bella for inviting me. It was a great pleasure. Actually, what I'm going to present here is not a project in progress, but more a project. At the very beginning, I'm bringing together some pieces from my different works here, and Here. What I'm trying to do is to demonstrate that we can use the Nakaz as a meta text, which really helps us understand how the poetics of the public political language and actually poetics of 1760s, 1790s in Russia works. So in some sense, what I trying to tell you could be called also to perform and negotiate the poetics and politics of Nakaz. And I would try, I would like to start with the same piece of Nakaz that served for Bella for her wonderful talk. So you have seen the same section. It's the conclusion of Nakaz, which is, it seems to me, is extremely important to read, to understand how the communicative frame of Nakaz, of the public society, which is imagined or created by Nakaz, works. And I would like to say here that I will cite different texts, different works, some of which are very far from Nakaz. And I don't think that we should consider Nakaz as the text that produced those texts. I think that Nakaz more gives us this feeling, this understanding of how it works, of the communicative community that produces this kind of poetics. So what the conclusion of Nakaz tells us about this text and about how it should be considered and about how it should be read. First of all, the text is not very clear and it's quite ambiguous. Next, however, it should be understood if, as Bella has mentioned, if read in fragments and with a concrete question. That's extremely important. So you don't read this text as a whole. You always have your own considerations. You come to it, you choose the fragments you want to choose, and you contemplate them, and you make something out of them. And it's like reading Proverbs. It's like learning by heart those sententia of Roman authors or other texts. So you might work with this text as an enigmatic text. Further on, yeah, it should be read collectively every month. And it is not perfect, like every product of man. So it may be discussed. And Bella has wonderfully demonstrated to us that it was actually discussed and it was programmed to be discussed in this way. So, and finally, it should be discussed to be completed with additional articles. So what also fascinates me in this conclusion is the fact that the way the text is presented is highly performative. In the French original version, we have two exclamative marks, which actually present us this part of the text as a dialogue. There are two persons. One says, "Chacun ne la comprendra pas." Not everybody will understand it. And the other one answers, "Sans doute." Well, certainly, like that. There are actually people talking here about this book in this paragraph. And it ends up at the center of the sentence, just cutting it at the conjunction puisque, de nu, понеже. Yes, here that's what we see here. Puisque, after that there is this great interval, odstup, and after that we have the proverb le travail et l'application surmontent tout obstacle, comme la paresse et la nonchalance détournent de tout bien. Donc, here we see this change of modes of pronunciation. We have dialogue, we have comments, we have some enigmatic proverb, and that's how this text works. It is not so much a prescriptive law. It's text that proposes us to contemplate, to choose whatever we want to contemplate on, and to actually discuss it, to produce our own understanding. And here it seems to me that with this point of view, we should consider Nakaz, and we should read it not only in the places of certain political meaning, like what Kirill wonderfully offered us with this topic of slavery, but Nakaz proposes us to think on actually every aspect of human life. We know that based on Montesquieu, what Catherine produces is bringing up the idea of relativity of morals. There is an extremely important notion of middle things. There are вещи между добрыми и злыми средние, которые по своему естеству не подлежат законам. And for the whole construction of Nakaz, this notion of middle things that are neither good nor bad, neither good nor evil, which cannot be prescribed by law, is extremely important. It's those things that are not prescribed by law. Those are the things for which the society is important. The society, the public opinion, the public sphere should exist in order to discuss these issues of what are those things between good and evil. How do we describe them? How do we understand it? How do we define them? Are they bad or good? And those things cannot be written in law. And law should be absolutely clear. The language of law, Catherine comments on it in Nakaz, should be absolutely clear, absolutely unambiguous. On the other hand, there is that language, that discourse of debates on средние вещи, which is all the opposite of the law. It's the language of ambiguity. It's the discussion of things on which we are not certain. And to understand how this discussion works, I should like to mention the fable of Holberg, translated by Van Wiesen. And the story goes like this. There was a goat who went to the city, and everybody in the city, when they saw the goat, mocked him because he was with a bird and everybody shaves their birds in the city. So the god decided to shave himself. He came back to his village, and everybody mocked him in the village because he has shaved himself. So his wife says to the god that both of you are fools. The moral is relative. There are no right ways of either shaving or not shaving your bird. It's the community which produces this norm. And it's with and that's what the public does. It discusses questions like this. If we read attentively «Всякая всячина», for example, we see that the questions that are discussed there are questions like this. There are questions of whether a man should use cosmetics, put rouge or not, whether a man should wear long dress or not, and so on. And the mode that is used to discuss these issues is what is called by Державин забавный слог. We discuss it in a manner which doesn't let the speakers understand if we are serious or not, because the norm is not defined. So we discuss a norm in a way not to demonstrate that we consider it a norm or not. So we can talk about shaving us up without fully demonstrating that we are for or against this. And one of the most important articles in «Всякая всячина» is an article which describes a society in which to become a member, you are presented with some kind of pretext, and if you understand it correctly, you are not accepted. But if you do not understand it correctly, then you are accepted. So this whole problem of how well do you understand what we are talking about, how well do you understand, are we serious or not? Are we really meaning what we are saying or not? That's the mode of discussion proposed in this society. Just to mention, here is that article on whether a man should use cosmetics, which uses the phrase «мужчина румянец, да какая мужчина?» And here using женский род «какая» for мужчина might be a typo, but it might be intended. And that's the way how these texts in this communicative frame work. Speaking about Kirill's presentation, that's normal that this question of peasant rebellion is hidden in Nakaz because we cannot mention it openly, but it can be hidden in those little pieces of the text, and it's the normative way of reading this kind of text. And here we come to those specific features of art of Catherine's times, which I would like to mention. For example, we know that after Catherine came to power, she ended up the tradition of fireworks as big political representations. Instead, she started using porcelain, which was intended for people sitting at the table, the dessert table. And those figures had to be taken in an arm, being regarded from different angles, and discussed between the people sitting at the table. There was no single interpretation of those figurines. For fireworks of Elizabeth, you had a unique authoritative interpretation. Here, there is no single interpretation. And this public mode is based on the idea that the interpretation is produced, it's produced during a conversation. And actually, that's how Lubki work. And it seems to me, that contemplating Lubki is extremely important to understand how this whole construction works. We know that those magazines of 1769, Всякая всячина and others, mention Lubki extensively. And I think that's because the mode of meaning something or not meaning something, mentioning something or not mentioning something, putting the questions of how something is interpreted. Are you vicious or not in interpreting the picture this way or another way, is central for the poetics of Lubki. It seems to me that actually the elites of 1760s were regarding Lubki and were producing this poetics of Zabavny slog that we read in satire, in magazines, and so on. Well, I will not. Yes. Another thing which is extremely important for this Zabavny slog is the notion of decorum, because everything can be discussed, almost everything, but in a way not to go against the decorum. There are boundaries, there are taboos or on the modes of expression. And that's exactly what we see in Lubki. Russian Lubki are quite expressive, but not as expressive as, for example, French ones. There are absolutely certain taboos, for example, in demonstrating male organs, male members, in this most explicit Lubok that we know, Taras Pleshivy. Another thing that is interesting here is the way that Nakaz proposes us to think of the norm is that the law should not mention those middle things, those средние вещи. They are not for the law. And that's exactly what we see in Catherine's legislation. For example, in Catherine's legislation, we do not see laws on rape or laws on sodomy. Here is a citation from Ustav Благочиния. We have laws on bani, laws on swearing, but we do not have any mention of rape. And what we see in actual practice of courts, we see that after 1760, after the late 1760s, we have much less cases of on fornication or cases on rape. We actually see this picture of rape being almost decriminalized. And it seems to me that sodomy, the same way, became decriminalized in Catherine's epoch, which can be attested by also by some look here. I will not go into details here. Just to sum up, there is this mode of public sphere where we discuss everything, but we discuss it in a way that everything that we say might be seen as a joke, as a mockery, which produces a vicious circle where actually public speech is an obligation of the community, but it's impossible to say something publicly which would be considered absolutely serious. How can one break this circle? Well, there are two ways. One is to extremely go against decorum, like it's the way of Radishev, who goes so far that Catherine's well, she reads, she starts reading him, she starts with mocking, and at the point where Radishev goes beside decorum, he starts mentioning her, she becomes really angry. Well, that's one way. The other one is insisting on the fact that there are things that are really good. There are things that are really bad. There are those things white and black, and that's the way which for Novikov or Karamzin, for example, follows. Well, thank you. Sorry for this ambiguous talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrei. That was fascinating. I think we will open the floor directly to your questions because these talks were so rich. I'll do my best to keep track of raised hands and you know, wave around if I fail to see that you have a question. So I'll open the floor. And it also may be that our speakers would like to respond to one another in certain ways. So I leave that to you as well. I actually have a couple of questions of my own, but I'm going to hold back for a minute until oh, I see Anastasia Litsova has a question, and then after that, Hildy. I think we don't need to unmute people, right? So Anastasia, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, and First of all, I want to apologize for my camera being turned off. This is broken. So I'm in the library now, and yeah, you can see this. But anyway, so Anastasia is so right. I'm a PhD student at Princeton University, and I have a question about the concept of sovereignty in Nakaz. And I think I want to ask this question, Kirill or Bella. But yeah, so basically my question is, did Catherine introduce something new by the way how she put the idea of samodержавия in the cast, right? So, and here I think about the last book of Paul Bushkovich about the succession law. So one of his arguments is that Peter the First, he did not introduce something new about the succession law. So basically he put on paper the custom which existed before him, right? So I'm wondering about the sovereignty on самодержавие and how Catherine understood it. Did she introduce something new, or Nakaz was a culmination of political intellectual experience which she inherited after she became an empress? And I'm asking this because, so like part of my research, so my research is about the Russian expansion and the concept of sovereignty under Catherine II. And yeah, so during talks was repeated quite a few times that the Nakaz is a compilation of different European books, right? Or like works on political thought. And yet, so what about sovereignty? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, great question. So I think there are three questions here. First, sovereignty in the sense of territorial sovereignty. Then there is sovereignty in the sense of kind of a source of power in a state, which is a theoretical concept that she does use. And then there is a Russian idea of самодержавие, which is not a theoretical concept. It is just a legal term or a quasi-legal term because it's not regulated by laws. So, and Nakaz is written in French, right? So what she does is that when she borrows Montesquieu's formulations for a despotic state, but then substitutes the word despotism for the concept of sovereignty, which is really cool because it shows that she knows her way around political theory, because sovereignty is a power that cannot be divided, right? Sovereignty is always самодержавная. But it's also kind of interesting that this does not solve all the issues, right? Because if the idea is to develop laws, then the concept of sovereignty becomes problematic, because sovereignty is indivisible in Western political theory, right? Then the issue of any powers that have power over the monarch are sort of made impossible, right? Sovereign cannot be limited by anything. And this becomes the major issue for noble constitutional theory, Van Wiesen, Panin, that kind of thing. They want to impose some kind of limitations on that. But this is something that Catherine always, of course, never accepts, right? And this is a long conversation. I'm going to just stop here.
Thank you, Kirill. Hilde Hugenboom, I see your hand is up.
Okay. I can't unmute. I cannot.
We hear you.
We can
Oh,
hear
you do? Okay, I'm sorry. I got a notice. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel. I'm fascinated by all your presentations. And it's really about time to work on this text in all the different ways that you're doing it. So I just have a basic question for everyone. The problem that Montesquieu is dealing with is, how can you have the kind of universal human being, so human beings across the planet all the same, but have such different forms of government? And he tried to explain that through climate. And so you find Thomas Jefferson trying to importing a moose to Paris to show the French that there are large animals in the United States, and this is an answer to the question of like, what are the United States capable of? So how do you see this tension in how Catherine deals with the peasantry and with Russia more broadly in the Nakaz? Thank you.
Please, I defer to our panelists.
Well, I would say that she proposes the public to discuss, actually. Yes, it's relative. It's extremely important that we have that land, which is enormous. There are different nations. There are different climates. There are different people. So let's just give them the possibility to discuss and negotiate
Yes.
what they're doing.
I would agree with that, with a caveat that the only people who are allowed to discuss are a very small minority of educated people, right? Catherine issues a whole series of decrees against discussion starting from the early 60s, against any kind of discussion by members of the lower classes. And she has, there is this beautiful letter to another official, which says, будете ли вы издавать законы, указы о молчании? This fantastic. So, and there, yes, the answer is yes, and there is a whole series of those. So, my response to Hilda's question would be that Catherine, indeed, in this sense, I think I agree with Andrei. Catherine does not take over the deterministic reading of Montesquieu, which basically says that political order depends on climate, partially because in Montesquieu's system itself, Russia does not really fit in the climate thing, right? It's the northern people are supposed to be free, and Russia is a despotic state, and Montesquieu never closes this gap, never solves the paradox. So I think for Catherine, it is a matter of not of deriving some features that should be applied to Russia, but it is a matter of really figuring out what the order should be on the one hand, and on the other hand, going back to Nastya's question, the basic assumption is that it is a sovereign monarchy. It is an unlimited monarchy. It will never be anything else. So once again, those things do not actually amount to much, right? They mutually cancel each other.
Yeah. And I think that contradiction between, quite honestly, having any document like the Nakaz that insists on absolutist monarchy is really, for me, quite central and quite, in a sense, generative for understanding the political processes, of this reign. I would add that I really like the formulation shared by Andrei, that this is that in a way that the Nakaz is an invitation to conversation, and I would sort of posit that conversation can also take place kind of in private. So in particular with Shcherbatov, he says, well, so Catherine, of course, very famously says that absolutism, samodержавие is necessary because Russia is so big. So you have to take decisions quickly, and you take decisions more quickly if it's one person. And Shcherbatov says, we don't know. That remains to be seen. Whether in fact a republican form of government, a republic or a monarchy, would in fact act more quickly. And he has this whole kind of this discussion about, well, what if the monarch is in love? What if the monarch is distracted? So, and to my mind, what's really remarkable there is that, again, for a text very, very likely meant for the drawer, it was published for the first time in 1935, as far as I know. I think it's really important, and I take Kirill's point that this is, of course, for a discussion for the elite, but it's really important that for this one individual in this text that is really for his own self in a way, there's just an opening. There's a question. Which form is better, republican government or monarchic? I don't know. Remains to be seen. That problem hasn't been resolved yet. I think that's really powerful. Yeah.
And Catherine herself, as David Griffith reminds us, said that she was a Republican. And there is definitely a radical streak in her thought, which I tried to bring out. The point is that she was never. She could be a radical thinker. She could never be a radical politician, right? As a politician, she had to be the conservative who would argue against things she would say in private, and this is what the antidote is.
Yes, yes. I guess an absolute monarch with a republican spirit, right? However
Yeah.
one understands that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I see a hand from Christy Monet.
Oh, hello. Sorry, I had to wait for the host to unmute me. Thank you all for this really fascinating sort of colloquium on this topic. And I have, it's a sort of an it's an imprecise question. Just some things popped up listening to you all, but specifically in Kirill's presentation, he mentioned that the Nakaz sort of has at its center the issue of the peasants as a problem, right, for governance, and that, you know, we can look to not only Catherine but other sources, Montesquieu, even Perry, whom I was delighted to see brought up these sort of ethnographic accounts of sort of the governance structure in Imperial Russia and what its sort of central problems were. And of course, the idea of this class, these peasants, is central. I was interested in the issue in this period, and as related to the Nakaz and peasants. I was interested in the concept of race and whether or not peasants are, or if the Nakaz in any way shows the peasants as racialized, not in the same way that some people might think of race as related to skin color, but race as related to people, for targeted people who for some reason are sort of presented as being inherently a problem within a society, that kind of negative racialization. How is that, maybe if we're thinking about sort of Republican versus absolutist forms of government and the workings of law, how might that compare, for example, to another ethnographic document, Nancy Prince, when she visits Russia in 1824, she makes it a really interesting observation that actually the Russian peasants, the enslaved Russian peasants, are also in a terrible condition, as are the sort of enslaved Black peoples in the United States. But that what's interesting to Nancy Prince, who is herself a woman who was born free, a Black woman who was born free in the United States, what's interesting to her is that it seems it's not just the peasants who are in a terrible situation in a sense in relation to sort of law, it's also the nobility. Like everyone is sort of under the will of the Tsar, she says in her writings. But paradoxically for her, this means that the everyday lives of the Russian peasants are actually sort of, to her observance, seem to entail less sort of violent physical cruelty than in the United States, where there is law, but whereas maybe the Nakaz, I guess, sees peasants as, you know, following Montesquieu, these are not beasts, these are humans, right? Well, this is great. Where in the United States, there's like another subcategory of human, well, not even human, I suppose. They are beasts, and so they're not subject to law. This is sort of like a weird paradox to me to think about, that in the Republican system in the United States, someone like Nancy Prince could see there are laws, but in fact, the workings of the laws make it so that those who are oppressed, enslaved, are to a harsh extent. Whereas because in Russia, there's sovereignty, but not perhaps the same type of law. but those who are oppressed are sort of oppressed equally with other classes above them. I don't know. I'm trying to think this through, and it's really your oh, thank you, Sarah. Just yeah, can you speak to just like, does the Nakaz take part in sort of this broader, even with Montesquieu, right, who's very racist views against East Asia in his writings, like, does the Nakaz take part in sort of racializing the peasants in a certain way towards an end of sort of figuring out what law is supposed to do in that society?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a conversation that Andrei and I have been having in Facebook Messenger for like years now. But my position here is that know that slavery in the Nakaz, but also in later Radishev, is not racialized in the Russian context, that it is a political phenomenon, and that is also something that is very interesting when Russians start talking about comparisons to American slavery, right? How slavery is basically an economic institution, right? And this is something that you can clearly see in the Russian discourse on Russian serfs. Of course, the Russian Empire conquers non-Russian, non-Christian groups and then destroys them in violent way. So it's not a non-racial situation, but fundamentally, the idea is that once you free the peasant, and this is happening, right? There are peasants who are being free and operating, former serfs who receive their freedom or something. They're no different. So it is fundamentally a matter of political structure and not race. This is my short version, and then maybe the others.
Well, my position is quite different. I see that well, I study Radishev, and I see a lot of racial language informed by reading of racial questions and American slavery in Radishev. But that's actually a huge topic on other set of texts, which would be wonderful to talk about.
Thank you. That is an incredibly important and huge question. And I think we might even return to it. We'll certainly return to it in 19V in May, but maybe people here want to return to it as well. I'm looking for raised hands. In the meantime, I will ask my small question, very much as a non-specialist in this period. It's a question for Kirill. What was the distinction you were making, and maybe I missed it, or were you making the distinction between rebellion and revolution, Bund versus Revolution?
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's so I wasn't clearly making it, but it's a very interesting kind of thing to think about. So the way I'm thinking about it is that rebellion is there as a phenomenon. It's just empirically there all the time. And then revolution is something it's a theoretical concept, which basically says that people have some kind of a natural right to overthrow government. There is a great article by David Griffith who comments on Catherine's reaction to the French Revolution and comes to the conclusion, just reading her letters as the French Revolution unfolds, that she does not have a concept of a revolution, that she doesn't know what it is. And I disagree with that article because I think that she pretends to not know in a particular kind of correspondence. Because of the monarch, she cannot endorse this concept. But in other kinds of sources, part of which I quoted, what I'm claiming is that there is a theory of revolution as a foundational transformative change from below, violent foundational transformative change from below, that is fundamentally legitimate. And there is this theory that is already there in Montesquieu, and there is a whole literature of the French-American historians of French ideas who actually trace the histories of the French concepts of the revolution as they start to emerge around mid-18th century. So basically, we know this from French intellectual history that it was not an irregular thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I would have more questions for you about that, but I'll ask them offline later. That's very, very interesting. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I don't want to cut us off early. Oh, it's not early as I see now. We're actually right on time, but this has been extremely rich, and I really appreciate it, especially, as a non-specialist in this field, there's a lot here for me to think about. And I will almost certainly be following up with our speakers individually to ask my questions. So thank you so much. Thank you to all three of the speakers. Thank you to Bella for organizing, and to Sasha and the Jordan Center for supporting us. Great work. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.